I I've been on TV.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our fall journal talk. We are here to discuss a decline in births and out migration from Kansas that is already starting to bring ripple effects, leaving state and local policymakers with difficult choices. And what we're going to be discussing today is about how these demographic shifts have already begun to impact K-12 schools. And there is a possibility that this impact could carry over to our state's public universities as well. And we have a really strong panel group today. We're kind of approaching this issue from all different angles. We have a journalist, we have a researcher, we have a parent, and we have a school board official. But before we get into that, just wanted to introduce myself for those that aren't familiar with my face. I'm Stefania Lugli. I'm the civic engagement reporter for the Kansas Leadership Center Journal, as well as for Planeta Venice, which is a English and Spanish news publication based here in Wichita. And I wanted to give a special thank you to our media sponsor, KMUW, Wichita Public Radio. You can listen to them on 89.1 FM. So just to kind of start us off, I'm going to have Joel Mathis. He is a journal contributor. He wrote a story discussing this problem. We're kind of referring to this repeatedly as the Kansas baby bust, as the decline in demographic is also contributing to a decline in enrollment numbers, which is impacting our school districts. And we've had 2 school closures already in the Lawrence area. So our writer, Joel Mathis, if you could kind of introduce yourself and just tell us one thing that you hope we can cover in this conversation today.
Hi again, I'm Joel Mathis. I live in Lawrence, Kansas, and I'm a longtime journalist in Kansas. I think the one thing I would like us to cover today is to realize that the baby bust is an important issue in its own right, but it also, as you'll probably tell from the discussion, begins to intersect with a lot of other issues. And so sort of sussing out the effects of the baby bust from kind of some of the other things that are happening can be very difficult to do, but it is definitely a through line in a lot of the conversations we're having.
Absolutely. And then we'll go, Melody, you can introduce yourself next.
Hi, I'm Melody Alexander. I am a parent of children who are enrolled in USD 497. My family was affected by the school closures. In fact, my husband went to Pinckney. My kids were at Pinckney, and we're definitely mourning the loss of the school.
Thank you. Donna Ginther, you can go ahead.
I'm Donna Ginther. I'm a professor of economics, and I direct the Institute for Policy and Social Research at the University of Kansas. And so I'm familiar with the demographic and labor market trends in the state.
And what is one thing you hope we cover in this conversation?
Well, that this is a very complex issue, and we need to do more to support young families and their aspirations for having children.
And finally, we have Dr. Anthony Lewis. If you could give a little brief about your role and what you hope we cover today.
Hi, my name is Dr. Anthony Lewis, the superintendent here in Lawrence Public Schools. This is my 6th year here in the district. And one of the things that I hope that we cover is that, as was mentioned earlier, that this is definitely a complex issue. And when we talk about declining school enrollment, it's not only a school district challenge, it's definitely a community challenge.
Okay. After introducing our panelists, we are going to move into our dialogue. I'm going to be asking each panelist a direct question. We do have some space for there being additional discussion, so don't think just because I'm asking one person one question doesn't mean that you can't jump in afterwards. You're totally okay to do that. But we're going to start off with our featured journalist, Joel. And I would like to hear from you, what surprised you the most while reporting the story?
That's an interesting question because to some extent this isn't a surprise. It's been happening for a long time. I want to go back and say a lot of the stories that I end up doing for the journal uh, seem to be very demographic driven. We already have the issue of many people in the rural parts of the state moving to the urban parts of the state. And so you're seeing a demographic shift that is very much kind of changing the character of Kansas as it is. On top of that, you have the baby bust that has been happening. Really, it got started around the time of the Great Recession. And it's not just a Kansas issue, that's a national issue. But when you combine it with Kansas's kind of previous urbanization, it begins to complicate things very quickly. Like I said earlier, I think the thing that surprised me the most was how much it's just difficult to kind of suss out the individual contribution of the baby bust to some of these other issues. I I talked with Melody for an hour about this story. I talked to Shannon Kimball, who's on the Lawrence School Board, for an hour as well, and there was so many other intersecting parts. You know, the school district isn't just facing declining enrollment; they also have higher expenses for things like insurance. Even there's also, you know, the special education funding situation. On the other side of it, you have, from Melody's standpoint, uh, you know, process issues that she was very concerned about when we talked during this process. So it's kind of hard to it's hard to see just this is a baby bust. What are you going to do about it? Because there's all these kind of complicated issues that come to play, and it's it's a lot of moving parts.
So, elaborating on those moving parts, I'm going to turn to Donna. We might have some listeners or viewers who haven't read the story yet. So I'd like to hear from you about what other factors there are that contribute to lower birth rates, how that compares to national trends, as Joel has mentioned, and what other demographic factors are directly impacting Kansas schools.
Well, first of all, this is a demographic problem that is being faced nationwide. We are in the echo of the baby bust. So the children of the baby bust that starts in 1965, they're having kids now, and they're delaying having kids or not having kids altogether. And so this baby bust means that there are just fewer children being born, right? So we have fewer kids. And then Kansas specific problems are another large problem. This is also nationwide, is the amount of student debt that we're saddling college graduates with, right? That student debt postpones marriage, postpones having children, makes children, prices people out of having children. A third issue is availability of childcare. We have 54% more kids than we have childcare slots in the state of Kansas, right? And the childcare deserts are spread across the state. Some rural communities don't have childcare. Urban communities don't have childcare, or if they do have childcare, people can't afford it. It costs more to send your infant to daycare than it does to pay in-state tuition in the state of Kansas. I mean, so the governor is taking steps to address childcare availability, and there's some evidence that more available childcare promotes fertility, but you know, we have a long way to go with respect to these issues. And a final issue is that we had very slow job growth, and this affects the migration component of Kansas population. Now we're reversing that really rapidly. We brought the Panasonic plant here. That's going to create 4,000 jobs directly and probably more jobs from suppliers. There are two chip plants being built in the state, which will also increase manufacturing jobs. So in the next decade, I'm expecting higher job growth because as a country, we are making a priority to reshore important manufacturing. So I think this is, there will be some opportunities moving forward for the state, but this is followed by, a decade and a half of really slow growth.
And are any of those factors that you mentioned, do any of them have a more direct impact on Kansas schools? Do you think something is more present in the state versus nationwide?
Well, in Kansas, it's uneven, right? Johnson County continues to grow. Their schools are growing. Housing prices in Lawrence, Kansas are really high, and that makes fewer people move here, right? Because we don't have as much housing stock and have affordable housing, Lawrence has stopped growing as a community, and that affects enrollments, right? We have a school system right now that is built for many more children than we have enrolled. And then on top of that, in the pandemic, a lot of kids just left the public school system and haven't come back. So this affects enrollments. I think that
I want to jump in real quick. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to say we talked about, and we have Lawrence people here today. But this is the school issues is not just a Lawrence issue. I think it's interesting because Lawrence is in the growing and urban part of the state, but obviously there are other places that are dealing with lower enrollments as well, and a lot of rural area parts of the state as well. So I think that's worth pointing out. The other thing is I wanted to second what Donna said. The governor, Laura Kelly, has really pushed this summer, I think, on the daycare front, and you see stories pretty regularly at this point about grants and other actions that her administration is taking to try and open up health childcare access right now. And so it's obvious the administration sees that as a really critical component of all this.
Could I jump in too? Just because there were several things that Donna mentioned that I think relate to, as Joel was saying earlier, the intersection of where I am with everything that's happening in Lawrence. Number one, I am originally from Illinois. Illinois has lost a congressional seat due to outmigration. And so I'm very aware, my senior year of high school, we had a school that joined our high school because their school closed. I'm very aware of what happens. We even had people renting apartments so that they could send their kids to my high school. I chose Lawrence and was a 41-year-old first-time mother. We purchased our home knowing we wanted to walk our kids to Pinckney. My husband was a stay-at-home father, and now we are at a point in our world where we are getting ready to start a new business where we are being courted. We currently have space in the KU Innovation Center, and I think, Donna, I just read your article about the impact that the Innovation Center has on the dollars that are being injected into the state of Kansas because of the types of businesses that are in the Innovation Center. But we are at a point where we're wondering what's left. Why are we staying in Lawrence when we have companies in Chicago and Kansas City that are contacting us saying, we will fund you, and we are looking toward a $1 million company that we could grow in Lawrence, but we don't know why we are staying here. So I think that's part of what a lot of people are feeling right now too.
Thank you for your testimony, Melody. So what I'm hearing is we're hearing about these policy decisions of what Governor Kelly is making moves within the legislature, and we're hearing about the emotional impact of some of these policy decisions. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Lewis with my next question. As we've mentioned previously, Lawrence Public Schools has made the decision to close 2 schools, both elementary schools, because of a decline in enrollment numbers and in budgets. So my question to you is, what impacts have you been seeing in the Lawrence community after the closing of the school, and how have you been navigating the loss that students and families may be experiencing after those closures?
Yes. First, I will start with saying that the proposal was to actually close 3 elementary schools and 1 middle school, and the board decided to close 2 elementary schools. And also up front, I want to acknowledge that the decision to close a school is emotional. I think you heard Melody a moment ago said that they were mourning the loss of closing that school, and there is research that states that a school closure is very similar to mourning the loss of a family member. And so it's certainly never an easy or even a desirable task to close a school, because it does profoundly affect parents, neighborhoods, communities, district personnel, and ultimately the students. And so when you think about the relationships that have been built in terms of a community, neighborhood, school, it definitely impacts that. And so in short, it just alters lives. And so you have families that, as Melody mentioned, that purchase homes in the area for a particular school. We had families that had not even had children yet, but still purchased a home in the area for a particular school. And our schools are families, and so definitely acknowledge that loss and that pain. And while the immediate impact or the immediate effects of closing a school is definitely painful, the long-term effects can be beneficial for everyone from a budgetary standpoint. And I've often said that, through challenges come great opportunities. And so when we made that decision to close those 2 schools, this was almost like a perfect storm coming together, because these conversations were happening in Lawrence well before I got here over 20 years ago, with some of the same schools, on the list then, 20 years ago. And the board at that time decided to not close the schools and rather invest in them. And the community passed a bond overwhelmingly, and the school district invested in those schools by remodeling in hopes that it would attract families to Lawrence, and that certainly was not the case. And so you compound that decision 20 years ago to not close schools and still operate small buildings, and it's much more expensive to operate small buildings. And at our current state level of funding, our district just could no longer afford to operate inefficiently. And also, Joel mentioned earlier the fact that we had higher operational costs. We pay full benefits for our staff. Obviously, insurance costs and other utility costs were increasing. And at that same time, our board and this community, when I first got here, was telling me and the board that we need to invest in our staff. At a time, again, post-COVID, when teachers were leaving all over the country, leaving the profession. This is what it was a huge priority, and priority one for us to invest in our staff by increasing their salaries. And so when you think about that, operating smaller schools and it being more expensive to do that, at rising cost and the ultimate priority of increasing staff salary, our board was faced with some tough decisions in terms of closing those schools. And that's the second part of the question. What does navigating the loss and sadness look like? I will tell you that our community came out in a major way in support of those schools, and that told me something loud and clear, that we have great schools here in Lawrence, and people are very passionate about their schools. So that's a good thing. But when you think about just the loss of closing a school, our building principals and staff in those receiving buildings did a tremendous amount of work as soon as the decision was made, beginning planning for the transition and welcoming those new students and families by creating things like play dates on the playground and informational sessions, tours throughout the summer, and then obviously at the beginning of the school year. And so yes, there have been some sadness, but there have also been some opportunities. Well, yes, I did not want my school closed, but some students have shared that in my new school, I have a larger playground, or I have more friends in this school. So it's something that we're still navigating. It's not anything that we can just say, okay, we check the box, we close the school, let's go on with our lives. We have to constantly, and we are constantly monitoring those students that were impacted by those school closures.
Okay. Thank you for that. Melody, I have a question for you as a Lawrence Public Schools parents. We just spoke a little bit about how the school closures was a loss for the community. So I would like to hear from you if you have any advice or experience that you could share for communities who may have to bear the weight of a decision like this in the future. And if there are ways that you think parents and other key stakeholders could be involved in the process of it.
I have lots of ideas. I think the big one, so I will give an example. I was reading, because as we've all been talking about, this isn't only happening in Kansas or Lawrence. I was just reading about school closures that are potentially happening in Seattle, obviously a big urban area. They have a parent and community organization called All Together for Seattle Schools. And one of the tenets of their organization was, we cannot close our way to well-resourced schools. And I agree with that. We cannot continue closing and think that we're going to be able to give kids and teachers the help that they need. I think that it will take the community. As Dr. Lewis said, many of us came out, we cried, we bared our hearts, we bared our souls, and we felt like it fell on deaf ears. Because of that, I encourage people to get organized. Don't accept not being heard as a reason to not take action. I was part of an organization in Lawrence called Save Our Schools. Technically, SOS does not have any, there's not a 501c3 involved with it. It's really just a lot of parents who are very concerned about the way our schools are going in Lawrence. All Together for Seattle Schools gets fundraising out there. They are actively going to the state, asking for more funding, demanding more funding, because really, I mean, that's where this comes from, right? We need to tax the people who could help pay for public education, because public education should be a right for all children. It should just be expected that children can be educated. And so I think one of our learnings was, we can't just settle on when it comes back up. We have to actively be involved. As parents tried to come up with solutions, say, please let us get involved, we were told that we were unable to, we didn't know what was going on. There were things we didn't know. Our ideas wouldn't work. And then we had candidates who were running on the ideas that parents were bringing forward. And so I don't believe it's enough to just, say, okay, we're going to fight for our school and then be done. It's an ongoing thing. People need to pass the baton when they get tired. It takes a village. And I think one of the big things that we're seeing is our community needs to rely on community, which I think is what Lawrence stands for too. We literally rose from the ashes. But we need to continue to do that as a community. And then I think just the other question about being involved with key stakeholders, I keep wanting to say demand it. I don't know that that's easy everywhere. I don't feel like it's necessarily easy in Lawrence, because we were trying to do that and we kind of felt like the board just had its mindset. And so there's got to be, I think Lawrence needs to trust the school district again. I think there's a lot of trust that's been eroded. I think Dr. Lewis said earlier that, they come for a quality education. That was why we had originally come. And now my husband, who was raised in Lawrence Public Schools, says it's not the school district it was when I was young. And so we've got to figure this out. And even talking to friends of mine who are teachers who got a raise, but it was like an $800 raise, and they're literally doing 4 times the work because 3 of their colleagues left and weren't replaced. we've got to find better solutions than that. That is not tenable for our teachers, and parents can be the people that can come in and hear what the teachers are saying and volunteer in the classrooms. We just have to be allowed.
Thank you for that. So we are going to turn to some audience questions. I have one that has been previously submitted from registering ahead of time, and I can see the whole virtual room having some buy-in into the question. So the first one that I'm going to move to is going to be, what did you find were the most important and most effective ways to make the decision process for closing buildings inclusive and transparent? I think for this, I'm going to turn to first kind of maybe take a step back. I'm interested to see if Jonna or Joel have seen examples of an effective and transparent decision process in either of the work, and then we're gonna kind of come in and step into the personal stories between our Lawrence parent and our school official about their personal experience in that. So Jonna or Joel, have either of you seen anything about what's been important and effective in making decisions processes like this inclusive and transparent?
I did see some of the analysis from the consultant. I mean, the city of Lawrence, the school district USD 497 is maxed out on the amount of money it can get locally. There's a state appropriation, and then there's a cap on how much local money we can get. And they've bumped into that cap. So it's they have to balance the budget, and unfortunately they weren't left with a lot of choices from the data that I saw.
Joel, have you seen? And
I think we're kind of still early in the process of seeing how this rolls out across the state. What I would say is that because schools are so important to families, to communities, I hear this question is kind of asking, is there some way we can make this process better and less hurtful? I think you heard from Melody, that certainly that's something that people want. But I think if you get to a point where you're talking about closing schools, there's going to be a lot of passion, and people aren't going to feel good about it unless you can find a way not to close the schools. And for some of the administrations, again, not just here in Lawrence, they haven't found their way to yes on that. So it's hard to say there is a better process. I haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
okay.
Just add to that, because I did do a lot of research trying to find if there was, a better way to make decisions like this. And what I was finding across the board, particularly from research from UT Austin, was that there's no evidence that that there's really a inclusive, transparent way to close schools that's heavily affected in underprivileged areas. And so in that, again, it's across the board. It seems that in all the research that I was reading, it's the people who need resources more heavily that are losing their schools.
If I could jump in here, I think when it comes to definitely something like school closures or any other major decision, having been in this work over 20 years, I don't think you're going to find a perfect process. There is probably no such thing as a perfect process. And you're going to have people that will typically attack two things, probably three, but it will be communication and transparency. And that's what's in this question as well in terms of transparency. As I mentioned, this is certainly not the first time we've had discussions on school closures. It happened 20 years ago. It happened a few years ago when we closed Kennedy. And when we think about just the what the research says about effective school size and what we know that where people are building schools, they're building schools for 500 to 600, over 600 students. Now we have one elementary school that's over 500. And so when we think about just the process that we went through, when we went through the Kennedy process, as a district staff, we engaged the community and went through that process. We heard from the community that the community didn't trust district staff, and due to the budget cuts, we had to cut some district administrators. And so one, we didn't have the bandwidth. And so we partnered with a consultant that led the futures planning process. And I do believe that that was an effective process because it involved a group of close to 40 individuals, from staff to parents to community members that came together with just ideas. You know, even, okay, if we don't close schools, what can we do? And we were at a point where, yes, we need to close schools and do some of these other ideas. And one of the things that came from the Futures Planning Committee was to research solar energy. And so we are moving forward and have moved forward with that in one of our buildings. And so just surveying the Futures Planning Committee, or this committee that was tasked with presenting the board an update, and they were asked, you know, although the school name was not attached, because you know how emotional that could be if you name a school. When we asked the Futures Planning Committee, should we close one school, 84% of them said yes, close one school. Should we close two schools? 76% of them said close two schools. And so while, again, there's no perfect process, there's some things that if we do this again, hopefully we won't ever have to do it again. But there are some things some lessons that we can learn. But I do believe involving a third party, outside perspective, and involving parents, teachers, other district staff, classified staff in the process is definitely vital to the decision that the board will have to make.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to move on to our next previously submitted question from our audience. So we're going to start us off. Okay. How do school districts actively support students and staff most harmed by the closing of schools? Are there additional resources for schools who take on children from previously closed ones? Counselors, para-teachers, teaching coaches, etc. Should districts be responsible for the collection of behavioral, educational, and emotional data of students and teachers from those closed schools? Is there any data being gathered from those directly harmed? Should school boards and upper admin have requirements for volunteering within buildings as part of their job duties to kind of help foster a better understanding of school needs? And the question kind of is summed up with, what's your opinion on upper administrations and school board officials becoming certified to substitute teach, which I think is just kind of implying if upper admin and school board officials need to kind of be more firmly placed in the classroom to kind of be interacting face to face, like with the impact of these decisions. And I think I want to hear from Dr. Lewis first about your thoughts with this question.
Well, certainly a lot there in that question to unpack, certainly. And so one of the things that schools can do in terms of supporting students and definitely staff who are maybe impacted by school closings, similar to what we did with our Kennedy students. And so within our student information system, if a student, say, has an IEP, or if a student is an ESL student, or a student is homeless, we have the ability to put an icon within the student information system so we can easily run reports. And so we did that with our Kennedy students, and we did that with our Pinckney and Broken Arrow students recently, so that we can run reports to see how their attendance is impacted, how their behavior is impacted, how their academics is impacted. And for the most part, the staff from those closing schools, maybe not necessarily the same staff, but those FTEs to follow the students. And so that support is there with those students. And as school systems, we can educate our children much better from a budgetary standpoint with in larger schools and fewer schools. And so when it comes to some of the work that we're doing to support, again, that transition on the front end is extremely vital, making sure that we're setting our students and families up for success when they go to their schools. But then after they get there, are we doing a good job in terms of making sure we're checking in on them, as our principals are and staff are currently doing, and identifying those challenges and providing those additional supports there. Just had a meeting earlier this week talking about additional supports for some of our buildings. And I'm trying to look at some of the other parts of this question. In terms of administration being required to a sub-license, if you're an administrator, chances are you probably more than likely are a teacher, so you don't need a license. You can just go teach. And so many of some of our administrators do go out in the buildings when there's not a lot of staff there, or just in the building to support the staff. Is there another part that you would want me to answer in that question?
Yeah, I'll have a follow-up question. So you briefly touched about how you have principals and teachers that kind of are checking in on one another. I'm curious about how direct the pipeline of information is from what's happening, whether, policy or emotional mental impact, like in a local school is. How likely is it that someone in a top position like yourself is going to be hearing about that? Like, do you have regular check-ins with these schools? Is this if someone only presents such quote unquote data at a school board meeting? How do you really get to learn about what's happening in those schools?
Yeah, well, first of all, we have some amazing staff at the building level, from mental health support to our counselors, principals, and teachers that obviously know who the students are in their buildings that were impacted by school closure. And daily, they do a tremendous amount of work supporting those students. We do also have principal supervisors that meet frequently with building principals, and they have an opportunity to hear firsthand, okay, hey, this is going well with these students. They're blending in, they're making friends. This is good. This is something we're doing in this building that you may want to share with another building. But they also have opportunities to hear, okay, this group of students, they're struggling. This is the support that we're providing. This is support that we need. And then that comes back to me during our executive leadership team meeting to hear about those concerns. Every Tuesday, we meet with our executive leadership team. And each meeting we have 3 different buildings that we are checking in on. And so we are able to discuss things that are going well, additional supports that are needing, and then deploy those supports to the buildings.
Okay, thank you for that. So Melody, just kind of looking at this question, there's like 10 questions on this page, but I'm going to summarize and ask you directly. Have you seen active support from the school district in, addressing loss or needs within your own student or students and the parents themselves? And if you have seen it, how has that been managed?
I have to say that really the only support outside of the teachers who are in the school and some principals, we had our emotional support person from the district who came by and was giving kids high fives the day after they announced that the schools were closing. We haven't received any additional support than what the schools just have in them. I think one of the things that I'm struggling with here is, seeing these, if it wasn't for the phenomenal teachers and principals that we somehow have at the district, I'm not sure we would have any resources. My son lost his first grade teacher already. By the time we found out that she was quitting, our principal had another teacher lined up who was highly qualified and has worked with us to make sure that he's transitioning. But my daughter's school had a teacher who walked out, and the parents found out the day before school returned from a break. And the teacher was replaced by just temps, who my understanding is don't even understand fifth grade math. And a lot of these kids were some of the higher needs kids from Pinckney. I think one of the hardest things for us has been that our community was fractured. So those of us who were looking out for each other and our kids and making sure that we were connecting and helping them with the resources that they needed, were not seeing each other anymore. And so while many of us want to be involved in schools, some schools allow us to be, others don't allow us to be. And so there doesn't really seem to be any consistency between the schools even. And so we're struggling with that. Our daughter's older, she's a fifth grader and is handling it easier than our 6-year-old is. But it would have been nice to have received a little more hands-on, here's how we're dealing with this. But I just kind of feel like it was left up to the teachers and the principals to figure out how to navigate it.
Okay. Thank you for that. I have a couple of more questions. These aren't audience submitted, so we're just going to kind of take a step back into some non-audience questions. So I think Donna would be the best starting off person for this question. Other than birth rate and education policy, what other indirect factors should the state be prioritizing as it makes progress to help and support Kansas schools?
Well, I mean, there are three things that I say the state, and this is about economic development, that the state needs to think about. First is broadband access. You know, when the pandemic hit, 10% of kids across the state didn't have access to broadband, and broadband is going to be the future. Connectivity is the future. Second is housing. We have, a lack of affordable housing in Lawrence, a short housing supply across the state. So we need more housing. And the third is childcare. We did pass a constitutional amendment. There's this the school funding case. Governor Kelly has fully funded schools, but in the state legislature, there are all of these attempts to undercut the public schools. There was a bill last year that was going to give $5,000 of state funding for tuition to a parent to go take their kid anywhere. Well, what did that mean? That means that rich people can get a $5,000 benefit and afford to put their kid in private school, but the rest of the people who don't have means are stuck, and their schools are going to be poorly funded as a result, right? So we need to think about what's happening in the legislature in terms of school funding. The fact that special education has not been fully funded means that that money has to come from somewhere, and it's affecting students who are not part of the special education cohorts. So I mean, thinking carefully about what our state is doing in terms of funding schools is very, very important, because if you have charter schools, or if you have this ability to siphon off the kids with means and subsidize them going to private school, that's what's going to happen, and your public schools are going to be in worse shape.
I think one of the things that to point out here is that you can have a risk of kind of a spiraling effect, where because you have fewer kids, you end up with fewer resources, and because there are fewer resources, people decide maybe not to have kids, or at least not to have kids in a particular location. And so that just kind of keeps the ball rolling and rolling and rolling more. And I think we're seeing maybe a little bit of that in some parts of the state.
Well, and Medicaid expansion, right? hospitals are closing. In advance of hospitals closing, maternity wards are closing. There are some places where you have to drive in the state where you have to drive 100 miles to deliver a baby, right? That's going to affect your decision to have a baby. So, I mean, all of these policies fit together and affect, the welfare of the schools and the welfare of our children.
I'd love to tap onto that topic too, because one of the things that, and I tend to be an optimist. I might not sound like it today, but I'm one of those pie in the sky types of people. And so one of the things we've talked a lot about at home is, people say, well, Donna, you mentioned earlier, the state or locally we're capped out at what we can spend in the schools. Well, why? And why can't we change it? And I've heard a lot from school board members in particular that say, well, you just can't do that. And I don't buy that because 100 years ago, Indigenous people weren't considered US citizens. At one point, women couldn't vote. African Americans were considered less than. Why can't we fight things? Why can't, again, concerned parents or advocates go and fight this and demand more? Because I think that's what it's going to take. Thank goodness we have Laura Kelly, because she really has started to turn things around. And I adore her lieutenant governor. I do have optimism that we can continue down that trajectory and that things can start to change. But I don't want people telling me I can't do that. I want people saying it's going to be hard and saying, again, take the baton, let's make it happen.
Well, I think that engaging with the state legislature, right? A lot of this is happening in Topeka. A lot of these decisions that are happening in Topeka are filtering down to the local level, and the local school districts are having to deal with policies that are beyond their control. So, like it or not, the policies that affect us most in this country happen in the state legislature. And there's very little attention being paid to those races and those policies and engaging with those policymakers. And so, I would encourage the audience, if they want to change policy with respect to education, visit with your state representatives and state senators and talk about the needs in your local school district, because that's part of state government. It's critically important. So yeah, it's going to take a change in Topeka, but our state representatives are supposed to respond to our concerns. And so we need to organize our voices accordingly.
And I would definitely echo that and encourage all the viewers to, and then this is what I say about Lawrence. And I jokingly say that it appears that people in Lawrence, when you were born, you were automatically given a marker and a poster, because it's an activist and a caring community that cares about everything here in Lawrence. And I would want Lawrence and other communities in the state of Kansas to take the same energy to Topeka. How we're currently being funded is, I'm glad the governor is fully funding schools, but we need more. And we think about fully funding special education to the 92%. That impacts every kid in the district, whether you're special education or not, because in our district, we spend annually about maybe close to $10 million out of our general fund to support, which we should, to support our special education because we're not currently being funded to the 92%. In addition, I would remind people that special education definitely includes our gifted and talented students, as well as, again, like I mentioned, when it's not being funded, that money is coming out of our general fund. And Donna, you also mentioned broadband. Again, that's something that we looked at heavily in Lawrence Public Schools, again, as a way to save money out of our general fund. We now have our own private wide area network here in Lawrence. And because of that, we'll save $3 million over the life of this contract. And so there are things that we're currently doing to obviously meet the needs of our students and families. Broadband is a huge barrier, but also looking at it from a savings standpoint. And, you know, as a result of the school closures and some of the other savings, we were able to, at a time when teachers around the country are not, well, students first are not going into the education profession, and teachers are leaving the education profession, we wanted to invest in our staff to the tune of $6.65 million. Our certified staff got about $3.7 million, our classified staff about $2.7 million, our administrators about $300,000. And so that was huge for us to definitely invest in our staff to make sure that we're keeping quality teachers in our classrooms.
Thank you for that. I do want to respect our time boundary of 1 o'clock. So I'm going to ask one more question before we turn into our final remarks. So rural, urban, and suburban districts alike are all facing this challenge of the baby bust. How can resources be allocated and prioritized in equitable ways? I think Dr. Lewis, you can start off the question.
Yeah, I think Donna mentioned some of it earlier. You know, when we think about just the rising cost of what it takes to just live as one human being now, let alone trying to raise a family. You know, I have a 28-year-old daughter and a 29-year-old son-in-law. They're not even thinking about having a baby right now. And so I think when we think about, you know, just from a housing standpoint, the cost of housing, the cost of childcare, those are some things that we need to continue to support as a community. I'm actually going to a ribbon cutting today at our early childhood community center here, where they were just awarded about $5 million to invest in childcare here in Lawrence. So it's going to take things like that where families see, okay, now I have access to childcare. Now let's talk about planning a family. Because if not, we'll continue to see decline. You know, just this past year, we had about 940 seniors, 12th graders that left our school district, and only about 670 kindergartners came in. So that we're still feeling the impact of the baby bust.
Donna, Joel, Melody, do you have any answer to the question about rural, urban, and suburban districts? How can you balance allocation of resources? Obviously, urban and suburban districts might be addressing a bigger student population. Rural areas maybe tend historically to get allocated less resources because there's less people. So how do you balance all that?
It's a tough one. You know, the rural school districts are supported by the state, but you know, you can't turn back demographics, and you have a baby bust plus outmigration happening in rural areas, and I suspect that there's going to be more rural school closures in the future.
One thing to point out here is that the school funding formula is very much based on the number of students you have. It's not like the state is saying we'll give you more money or less money based on whether we like you or not. It's if you have 100 students, you get X number of dollars. If you have 200 students, you get twice that amount of money. And so if you have fewer students, you're going to have less state funding coming in, and that is going to affect the decisions that get made.
I think for me, this is a really tough question, but a couple of things. One, I come from a rural community, but innovation, I think, is in looking at things differently. Potentially, a lot of high schools that I was in school with would collaborate. They would have or co-ops where they would figure out how to bring their schools together to do things like provide science teachers, provide track, football opportunities. There might have to be more of that type of innovation. My high school just had somebody who won an entrepreneurship award for cattle, which would not likely fly in Lawrence, Kansas, but he won a huge national award for it in my hometown. I also am going to come back to community because I can tell you that I was somebody who put off having children for a long, long time because of scenarios like this. The day that the schools closed, I went home and I hugged my son. He was asleep and I bawled my eyes out. We can't protect them from everything. But when you have people who are going through it with you, who are willing to, I will say it again, take the baton, it makes it easier. And what I found is that people who don't have as much as I have need those resources, and we found ways to give them the help, give them the support that they need. And I think all communities need that.
Thank you for that. So with that, we're going to conclude our journal talk. I'm just going to go around our virtual room once more, and each person, if you could just answer your final question in just a couple of sentences. So we'll just start with Melody. From your point of view, how can the average community member be a part of making progress on this challenge? And you've obviously spoken very eloquently about this, but just in summary.
Find the people who are on the same page as you. I do think there's a slippery slope when it comes to people wanting to privatize and do some, different things in some levels, but finding the people who can lift you up when things are hard, when you think that you can't go on and you don't know how you're going to get through it. Somebody else is going to be there willing to take on the challenge and fight for our kids.
Yeah. Donna, go ahead.
I think that you need to engage in the process. We just had local school board elections, talking to your representatives in the state legislature, talking to your school board members, and talking to the administrators, I think is really important.
Dr. Lewis?
Yeah, I would say just continue to share all of the wonderful things that are going on in your school district. We are certainly continuing to sharing the great things that are going on in our school district. With open enrollment, it's another opportunity for us to show other students and families around the state how exciting and amazing Lawrence Public Schools is. And then lastly, stay engaged with your school board and in local elections, and go to school boards. Most school boards are virtual and you can watch them at home, but just stay engaged, and not just when it's a major issue, but when it's the smallest thing, stay engaged, because those smaller things can lead to big things. And so it's important for you to be engaged on the early end of it.
Thank you. And Joel?
I would say pay attention to what's happening in Topeka. A few weeks ago, the Docking Institute at Fort Hays State University released its annual Kansas Speaks survey. And what it said about the priorities of Kansans, including in schools, it's worth asking if those priorities are shared by the legislature. You can sometimes see a disparity between the two. So, for what that's worth.
Thank you for that. I just want to give a big round of gratitude to our panelists, Melody, Donna, Joel, Dr. Lewis. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us from your expertise and your personal experiences. I hope that you all learned from one another. I hope our audience found this conversation as equally illuminating as I did. I want to thank our audience as well for tuning in and for giving us some questions. I know we weren't able to get to everything, but this is a really large topic that is very difficult to keep to just 60 minutes of conversation. So just want to thank everyone involved. And for more context about this and to see why we're having this journal talk in the first place, please read Joel Mathis's story. It's at klcjournal.com. And you can learn more about this issue. So great. Thank you so much, everyone. And I hope that we all have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.